welcome to our event. As you know, the theme this year is duty, and we have two of our distinguished faculty members here to discuss a particular aspect of duty, namely the duties of men and women. The question today, do men and women have different duties? So Talcott, as you all know, is a professor of philosophy, and Professor Wilkinson, instructor in writing and humanities, will begin with some opening remarks. Dr. Talcott will go first, followed by Professor Wilkinson. They will then have an exchange, some questions back and forth, kind of an informal follow-up on those remarks. And then at that point, we're going to allow for audience questions, but we're going to do that by having you submit written questions. Jonathan Roberts, there's going to be some note cards coming around. You write down your question as it arises, pass it to Jonathan. He'll then pass them to me, and we'll have probably about a half hour or so at the end to ask and respond to those questions. For those of you interested in mixing the crass attainment of graduation with the intellectual pursuit of enlightenment here, there is a sign-up sheet coming around, and you can add your name to it, get credit for being here for the Interregnum requirements. But I'm sure that's not what brought you here. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Professor Talcott. Mr. Wilkinson, please join me in welcoming them to the floor.
All right, thank you, Dr. Parks. Thank you all for coming out today. This is a great turnout. When Jonathan Roberts asked me, I don't know, a month or so now ago, whether I would participate in this event, I thought, well, let's see, this is great. We don't really understand duty anymore. We don't really understand men and women anymore, so this should go really well. But I am glad to be here. I'm glad to be here with Professor Wilkinson. We are friends with each other, so if you're looking for kind of an explosive debate, you're probably going to be disappointed. But if you're looking for some enlightening and helpful discussion amongst friends, then you will probably not be disappointed. Okay, so let me start and say just a few things about duty. Duty as a concept, as a thing. So in contemporary academic discussions, if you're going to do an academic discussion of duty, if you're reading an academic paper and it's talking about duty, it's talking about it in the sense that Immanuel Kant used it, German philosopher, lived and wrote about 200 years ago. Duty was his central moral concept. And duties for him were duties of rational agents, okay, persons, rational agents. This is an abstract idea. It's not a concrete, embodied, physical thing. Rational agents, okay, so duties of rational agents. You're a rational agent, I'm a rational agent. We all have duties in light of that rationality, okay? Duties to ourselves as an agent, duties to each other. Now, pre-Kant, in the pre-Kantian discussion, if you read stuff before 1800, when you talk about duty, and you're reading philosophers or theologians, duty is generally attached to relationships or to positions. Okay, so you'd have duties as a teacher, right, or duties as a student, duties as a speaker, duties as listeners, duties as sons, duties as fathers, duties as citizens. So different relationships and different positions would impose different duties on you. Okay, so a great text, if you want to read some of these things, is Cicero on duty, De Officiis. Talks about the duties of lots of different groups of people. It's a great classic text. The Church Fathers wrote about duties of different roles and relationships. The Reformers did. So this is the pre-Kantian notion of duty attaches to relationships or to positions. Okay. All right. So what are our duties in our varying relations? Here's a basic framework to think about it and to get us into thinking about men and women and duty. Okay. So first off, we have a fundamental relation. Each of us does. And that is we are creatures. We are creatures that have a creator. God made us. Right? Us and everything else. Everything that's a creation has a duty to its creator. All right, so all of us have duty as creation to give glory to God and to enjoy God. God made all things for his glory, right, and for creation's enjoyment of him. So this is a duty of all creation. But we have duties specifically as the part of creation that we are, right? We are humanity, right? We are Adam, we are man, we are humanity, right? We are rational creatures, rational animals is how theologians and philosophers have understood it, right? We have minds, we have bodies, and we worship God with who we are, all of who we are. And here's a general principle. Everything glorifies God. Every creation glorifies its creator through its specific nature. Rocks glorify God through their rock nature. The planets glorify God through their planet nature. Right? The heavens are telling the glory of God. I've read that in the Psalms, right? What does that mean? The heavens, through what they're doing, are declaring the glory of God. Everything through their nature does and ought to declare the glory of God. Okay, so us as humanity, right, we glorify God through our specific capacities and our specific nature. Right, so what's the greatest commandment? The summary of God's law? Right, love God with all of your heart and soul and mind. Right? All of your specific capacities as a human being, you love God with all of them. Right? All your affections towards God, you turn your will toward God, turn your intellect, your mind toward God. Right? All of our created specific capacities as human beings, we use to glorify God. We turn them toward God. Okay. Third, our specific natures as male and female, as man and woman. Right? God did not make us androgynous. In the beginning, Genesis 1, God made us male and female. Right? We are created as two different kinds of human beings, male and female, from the beginning. All right? He could have made us androgynous, right? He didn't have any necessity. There was no, the nature of being didn't compel him to make one kind of human being. He could have made one androgynous creation from the beginning. We could have had a world with just men or just women or neither or some third thing. But he decided from the beginning to make humanity male and female. All right, so he gave us distinctive natures with distinctive capacities, functions, and callings. And these functions are reiterated, reinforced, and lived throughout the scriptural witness and throughout human history. So to be brief, I'm going to try to sum up what I see as the distinctive, in a broad sense, duties, but more really callings or functions of men and women. And I'm going to do a threefold distinction, threefold for men, threefold for women, in terms of laying out how, in terms of our specific natures as male and female, we glorify God. So to be brief, the man has three distinctive callings: provider, protector, and leader. It's man's job to ensure that the community has what it needs to function well, to provide. It's the man's job to ensure the community is safe from harm and from threats. It's to protect. It's the man's job to ensure the overall proper functioning of the community, and through formation and correction, direct the community to flourish, to lead. All right, 1 Corinthians 11:8 says man is the source of woman. He's her provider and protector. He's a representative and leader. And out of love for God and love for neighbor, he willingly takes up these callings, or he ought to. If we, as humans, right, we have the choice, unlike rocks, that we can decide not to do what we were created to do. That's part of the unique human nature. But it's not good for man to be alone, right? The male human is the only creature of God which, after making him, God says, not good, right? It is not good for man to be alone. Woman was created as man's partner in life, right? His companion, his associate, and his helper. Right? So here's a general principle. Men and women were created, okay, to function together as partners in life, both within marriage and outside of marriage. Men and women were created as partners in life. Okay, a world of just men is not a good world. A world of just women is not a good world. Right? A world of partnership with the two, man and woman, with each fulfilling their distinctive callings, with their distinctive capacities and natures. Right? That is the world that God desires. That's what he created at the beginning. Okay, so women have a distinctive calling and function alongside the man. God created a unique partner for Adam, one suitable and perfectly corresponding to him, fitting with him, completing him, filling out the things that were missing and lacking. The same as him, yet very different from him, right? Bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. So the three distinctive callings of women that I see directly match onto the distinctive callings to men. They were made for each other, right? They fit with each other, and they correspond to each other. So woman's first job is to nurture life. To nurture life. Her calling is maternal in the broadest sense of that term. Okay, this includes biological, but it includes spiritual, emotional, psychological, sociological, philosophical. Right? In the broadest sense of the term, there's a maternal function that corresponds to, correlates with man's paternal function. This works itself into all spheres of life, domestic, public. We carry ourselves as men and women into every sphere of life. Right? So the nurturing function, which corresponds with the protecting function. Man protects so that woman can nurture. All right, second, it's woman's role or job to directly serve needs. Directly serve needs. This corresponds with the provider role. Okay, man provides so that women can use what he provides to directly engage people, to directly engage persons, right, to directly serve others. All right, so as a basic example, right, I earn an income, and my wife pretty much spends it however she wants to spend it, right, to serve directly the needs of our household, to make sure the needs of the household are directly met, so that my children have clothes, so that we have enough food to eat, so we eat, right, we eat something healthy and nutritious and appealing looking. Right. So the function of directly serving, right, which is correlated to and corresponds to the provider role. Man provides so that women can directly serve. All right, third, it's woman's job to lovingly affirm, come alongside of, and support the leadership of the man. She is to orient herself under his direction, following his lead as a partner. This is necessary for the unity and the harmony of society, domestic and public. Because if there's going to be order and harmony and unity, there has to be affirmation of the leadership instead of continual strife. Okay, so it's necessary for the accomplishing of the task given to man at the beginning, both being fruitful and multiplying, having dominion over the earth. So, as I see it, these are the basic callings for man and woman. I'm comfortable calling them duties in a very extended sense of duty. Definitely not necessarily a post-Kantian sense. These things they were created in the garden. They're present in the garden. They're inscribed in our natures. They're embedded into our biology and our psychology. They have been recognized to various degrees in Christian history, throughout Christian history. They've been recognized throughout pagan history, throughout non-Christian history. These have been the basic functions or callings for men and women. And I don't think that our 21st century world is so radically different from every other age that we're in a position to think the callings and the functions and the duties are no longer applicable to us. So I would suggest thinking about a society that is a sexual society, not an androgynous society, a sexual society, right? Like a good partnership, a good sexual dance of masculine and feminine, rather than a dry, drab, gray androgyny. So in rough, just to use every possible, political term to support my view. No, so that's my sort of that's a framework that I use to approach it. These things are grounded as I see it in Scripture, in nature, and they've been recognized throughout history. So.
Great. So I am going to tell you briefly where I'm coming from and give you my sort of theological framework for thinking about men and women. Some of you know this, but my background is from a pretty highly patriarchal, fundamentalist background, to the point where I wasn't allowed to go away to college because I couldn't be out from under my father's authority. So that was the framework that I came from, and obviously I moved in some direction from there, but and when talking about this, we realized that a lot of our concerns had a lot to do with the kind of differing backgrounds we come from and the different sides of what we feel like you guys might be running into, and that's important to both of us. So that's where I come from. There was also a sense that women were both more subject to moral failure, and yet they also were like this domesticating influence, so they were kind of like second class in the sense that they couldn't be trusted. But also they had to be there in order to make everybody behave. It was a very odd schizophrenic way to think about femininity, but that's where I came from. So here's where I've landed. Okay, so we start at the top, right? God made the world and he said it was good. So it's good at that point. And at that point, there are male and female, right? There are not just male and female people, though. There are maleness and femaleness exists in the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom as well. So just the fact that we're male and female is not the part that is God's image in sort of a sexual distinction way, right? That obviously exists. Rabbits, for instance, right? Okay. But that's good, right? But when God says he made male and female in his image, it's not so much I would imagine, the actual sexual functions that are uniquely in God's image as much as what it is to be male and female in uniquely human ways. So I think that is important. Then at the fall, and I fully agree with this idea that duty only makes sense within relationships. So when I first looked at the question for this, I thought, duty toward whom, right? So I don't have just random abstracted duties. I have duties within particular relationships that I'm called into, which is, I'm married. I also have male and female friends. I have a mother. I have a brother. And then I have brothers and sisters within the church, and then I just have people at large that I interact with, and I have relationships with all of those people. So at the fall, those relationships got broken with everything else in all of creation. They got broken, right? And other things happened at the fall too: death and disease, pain and childbirth, right? Replacing work with labor. All those things are things that happen at the fall. But I believe, and I come from kind of a broadly reformed framework, that God is in the business of renewing the world and of trying to roll back the fall. And we as the church, if we are part of the church, are asked to join that as the body of Christ on earth. So that's our duty, you might say, as the church, is to join in God's work of rolling back the fall. So we each have our own unique set of callings or vocations. Vocation just means calling, that we're called into as part of that. So some of those vocations are self-evident, right? I'm born to my parents, and so I have a calling to be a daughter to them, whatever that looks like. I also have a calling to be female, because I was born and continue to be female. Other things are callings that have to be discerned. So I was not born knowing that this is what I would end up doing at this point in my life, but this is a calling just as much as those things are. And often when we use the word vocation, especially in evangelical circles, we use it really badly and think of it as just our job, but really I think it's all these different callings that we're called into, and they overlap, and that's who we are, where our callings overlap. That's me. Okay, so we can't flourish if we reject our calling. Jonah, right, rejects his calling, and things end badly until he comes back to it. And this is true for all our callings. So I cannot flourish if I'm not well fulfilling my calling as a daughter, which is something that I'm not naturally gifted at, sort of being like this nurturing daughter figure. And so that's something that I have to choose to live into. And furthermore, in our time, we have to choose as well how we're going to live into our calling, that is our gender. Right, so I made a comment that was offhand and much tweeted yesterday in Postmodern World about how I wasn't born, or I can never be a black man from Harlem. Except I can, actually, almost, right? Like, in this day and age, I could get pretty close to that point. So, the reason for that... just soak that in for a second. The reason for that is that we live in an age where technology, in particular, has made it possible for us to... And social norms and things have made it possible for us to run away from nearly every calling we have in a very complete sense. But we don't flourish if we're running away from our callings. God calls us into things because he wants us to flourish, and he wants us to be who we are to be on the earth. Okay, so if the church is looking to roll back the effects of the fall, I feel like I'm pointing like this, and I don't do that a lot, I don't know why, and join in promoting flourishing, then that's for all things that have been broken by the fall. So that includes our minds and our bodies and our souls and our institutions and our relationships and all these things together. And we can see how the church and also God just working through humanity, through common grace, has actually managed to roll back some very direct effects of the fall, right? So sure, it's still, I'm told, painful to have a baby, but there are things that we do now that help mitigate some of that pain, right? And so we've, in a sense, been able to roll back some of those effects. Or we don't have to farm anymore in order to feed our families. I can pick up my iPhone and order that stuff from Fresh Direct, right? And it'll be on my doorstep tomorrow. That is all because of technology and because of developments. And so that backbreaking labor aspect it has shifted, at least, and it's not literally backbreaking anymore, right? I don't know, maybe philosophy is a backbreaking labor. It's okay, so we have medical technology, we have labor-saving technology, we have all these things that have come about that have actually helped to roll back some effects of the fall. That's a good thing. We can affirm that and be grateful for that and not feel guilty about that, because that is what God's work is. So this is where things, I think, get sticky, in the sense that our relationship between genders was also broken by the fall in really profound ways that we still see all around us, right? So gender wars, is that even the word I'm looking for? But just like sort of this feeling of enmity, right, and animosity between genders. Or this sense of being subordinated, right? So not just that you are helping, but that you're being oppressed, which certainly happens all the time, right? And we can see some really clear and present ways around the world where women are oppressed, which is not to say that they're not ever oppressed in our society either. But we have it pretty good, right? So this is a effect of the fall that I believe the church is called to lead the way in helping to roll back. So the church also exists in particular time and space, but the church is also the body of Christ, like across time. So the church itself, and I have a very high view of the church, is both particular in its time and also transcendent. We have both of those features because we both exist in our particularity and we're the body of Christ, which goes across time. In the church, though, the kingdom has already started to come, right? So there's this real sense that in the Eucharist, when we take communion, this is like we're feasting at God's table in a way that's mysteriously more than what it appears to be just eating bread and drinking wine or grape juice or whatever you do. And so there's like a new order within the church. Some of the neo-Anabaptist types will talk about the church as an alternate polis, right? We're something that exists in the world, but we're something else too. When the church comes together, there's something more happening there than a bunch of people who kind of think the same things getting together and hanging out for an hour and a half on a Sunday morning, right? So this means that within the church, and people who are part of the church need to, I believe, embrace the particularities of what make us male and female, but with an eye on how those things interact with the different callings and giftings we have as members of the church. So this means that we do it within our culture. There's a baby in here. We do it within our culture, but within the possibilities in our culture that are available to us. So there is an argument, and I think I agree with it, that Jesus, when he sent out his disciples to evangelize, right, in the Gospels, he didn't send out any women. And I've heard people say that's because women shouldn't do that. And I've also heard the argument that in that culture, right, if Jesus had sent out women, it wouldn't have just been revolutionary, it would have been scandalous in a bad way. Like, it would have actually thrown up barriers to the work of evangelism, because in that culture, a woman traveling alone would have been, I don't know, a whore, right, or some kind of really terrible thing. And Jesus knows this, and this is a secondary issue. But Jesus also, in radical ways, affirms the place of women. So this story of Mary and Martha is not merely about how you should, like, sometimes take a break from work in the kitchen in order to sit at the feet of Jesus. It's also the fact that Mary is in a context, sitting at the feet of Jesus, that is a male context for those people. This is not a culturally accepted thing for a woman to sit at the feet of a great teacher in that sort of male context. And so Martha's scandalized, not just because she wants somebody to wash the dishes, but because Mary is in this place that's dangerous, right? And so Jesus says, no, like, she's doing the right thing. This is her place. This is what she should be doing. But these are places where the church was being revolutionary, but they're also working within their culture so as not to cause stumbling. And something I was reading was saying, any pastor knows, again, I presume this is true, that you don't just walk into a church on day one and enact sweeping change that everything is fixed, and then it's fixed, right? People, it takes time. You have to move people and cultures along gradually. So, at the end of the day, all these things for me combine to say that I do think, as a good Reformed person, that there are normative patterns and giftings that we have as created beings, that we're not able to construct ourselves as blank slates. So we're not just born androgynous, that's right, and then we sort of decide what we're going to do, and then we do it, right? We're born male and female, and we are called into those things. And I do think they generally follow the pattern of Christ in the church. I fought against this for a long time because I felt like it was a marketing ploy, but I guess it's not. This, like, love and respect thing, I think actually there's something to it, that women at core need to be loved and men at core need to be respected. And I kind of generally and broadly, but carefully affirm the functions thing as well. That protecting and providing and nurturing and supporting and those things, it does seem to hold up. I think probably the only places that we really disagree are where that might always be expressed in particular cultural instances, if that makes sense. And this is because of the ways I've seen it in my life and in the lives of women I admire. I'm coming to the end. So these callings can and should be followed also outside of the marriage context because they're about reflecting God's nature. They're not about sex, merely the function of sex, which is in the parts of creation, again, that aren't in God's image, right? So our duty in relationship, then, is to affirm each other's genders, male and female alike. So I am as called to affirm my female friends in their femaleness as I am to affirm my male friends in their maleness, and furthermore, my husband, right? So this does mean to me that if I'm in a situation in which I need to be protected, I don't rebuff that. Like, I'm not going to say, no, like, I can take care of myself. I affirm that. I affirm that impulse, right? And furthermore, it means that I don't push my way into a situation and insist that I should be the one speaking when I know that there are multiple people in the room, some of whom are men, who also ought to be speaking into a situation. I want to affirm that impulse in men I know. And this also means that I can, in my particular context, which I'm in a Presbyterian church that does not affirm the role of women in ministry, I do submit to my pastoral authority there. That's not a matter of ultimate importance to me. But it also means that I recognize and celebrate giftings that aren't typically male when I see them in men. So my husband is a far more naturally compassionate and good listener than I am, as some of you probably know. And I see that in him as a strength and not a weakness. It's not a typically female thing, and so it's a weakness. I see that as a great, great strength in his character. And it means I've been predominantly mentored by men. I've had almost no female mentors, and I'm grateful for the ways that they have affirmed me in my femaleness as well as in my particular giftings. So they see me not just as our culture would tell them to see me as some kind of sexual object, but to see me as a person who has particular giftings that ought to be affirmed. Okay, I think I'll just say this, which is, to me, it's really important that we here come to understand how we can interact in relationship with one another healthfully as men and women, and how we can affirm those things in each other outside of the marriage context. Because, frankly, if you marry anyone in this room, it will hopefully only be one person, right? But you're called into relationship with pretty much everyone in this room. So what does that mean, right? Are we doing anyone any favors when we disrespect each other or when we fail to love one another? No, we're not. And furthermore, we're actually like denying the gender of the other person in some way. And that seems important to me. What that looks like ultimately within the church, I don't know yet, and I haven't got a good answer for that. But I think that that's a very important thing for us to be thinking about. So how do we interact with our own callings and our giftings at the same time? So if my gifting is not typically female, how do I be female within that gifting? And also, how do I interact with other people and help affirm that calling in them and help them grow into their calling? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I'll stop there. I'll ask you a question. Okay, I'll ask you a question. Okay, so this occurred to me while we were talking. How do we know when we are expressing our functions well and when they're getting out of whack? So when do we, what's the line between protecting and subordinating your family in some kind of unhelpful way, if that makes sense? Sorry, I know that wasn't something we talked about.
No, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a simple answer. How to draw that line. I would think about what does it look like to do the function well, and what do the perversions of the function look like, right? What do the deformities of the function look like? There are particular deformities of each of these functions, right? We could do a whole thing on how to violate your duty, right?
Probably would have been more helpful.
Well, that would have been more fun, probably. So I don't know if I have a simple answer to that, that I'm able to give. Just think about what a good, we have different words, right? They mean something different. But there is a general problem with a lot of these, right, is discerning the concrete application of them. That requires prudence, that requires wisdom, requires experience, a lot of caution, a lot of hope. So, prudential judgment.
Okay.
I guess it's my turn to ask a question. So, I'm wondering if you think, or if you're able to say any more about, maybe you can't, I'll ask a similarly hard question. In your way of thinking, does mature godly manhood and mature godly womanhood look different in any way that we can characterize? Or is Christian maturation a gender-neutral or androgynous process?
It's called loaded language.
Well, so if it's not that, which I think we don't want it to be that, can you say any more to characterize how to go about doing that? We have a lot of young men and young women here. They want to become mature, godly men and women. How does the fact of being male and female, what does that tell us? What does that tell them about how they should think about developing themselves? Or how God is going to develop them?
Yeah. So I would not presume to characterize myself as a mature person, because that seems weird. But I have found, so I'm not a naturally caring person at all, as my mother could tell you, has told me since I was little. And my mother is, which is is why she says that. So for me to become a mature, godly woman would be for me to develop that within me in ways that are, I think, perhaps more urgent in some sense. Partially because the thing that I see mostly in Scripture that talks about how mature men and women should work is that they should mentor younger people. Like, this is something that comes up in 1 Timothy, right? So that the older women should teach the younger women, and the older men should teach the younger men. And that the sense there is like mentor. And that is a function into which I was thrown violently when I began teaching. And it was difficult for me at first because I really didn't understand how to do it. So that's a capability that I've had to develop within myself. Now, I don't think this helps the matter at all to say that I've learned more from Tom about that than I have from anyone else, just watching him do it well. But I think there's a sense in which the fall twists breaks our genders for ourselves, I think, in the sense that it's easy for me to waltz on in and say, hey, look, like, people pay me to do stuff, so I'll just provide. But I don't see, so in my family, right, my husband's an artist, and people don't pay artists to do things, and I get paid to do this. It's not just my volunteer work. So I am, in some sort of like broad sense, the provider in my household. Like, I do bring in the salary. That's what I do. But I do see it as service more than anything else. I will say that. Like, I think of it in that framework, and I don't do it because my husband has abdicated some kind of thing and decided he would rather play Xbox, right? Which I think sometimes he probably would. But it's not that's going on there. It's him and I within our relationship, which is unique, and we match each other in odd ways. Within that relationship, we've decided this is how we're going to work this out, at least for this season. And for us, that has pushed us towards maturity in different ways. I don't even know if there's another way to say that. Maturity looks so different for every person. That certainly our genders play into it, but so do our giftings and our callings. And so our duty is to develop both of those things, I think. And it's actually, I think, very hard to talk about gender as a specific calling abstracted from other things. That would be my sense of it. I have the question about education. So the question is, and I've heard some of you ask this before, or I'm sure you've thought it. So if a woman wants or sees her primary calling to get married and have children, if that's what her sense of what her calling is, where does higher education fit into that in your sense?
Just broadly higher education.
Eric Bennett.
Thank you, Eric.
Well, okay.
So let me say a few things.
Still ghost stories.
Forgot our lanterns.
Yes.
So let me first address specifically, like, the ladies here or women who would otherwise be going to college and things like that. I see education being very valuable in carrying out both of the what I see as the callings of men and women. My wife hates it when I talk about this, but she was a valedictorian of her high school class. Now she is a stay-at-home mother, taking care of 5 children and homeschooling several of them, and married to me. So, do you think it's valuable for her to be smart and educated, and she has a piano performance college degree? Do you think it's valuable? Yes, it's very valuable. It's extremely valuable to have good education, as much of it as you can reasonably get. So, if someone came to your office and said, well, I just want to be a mom, I'm going to drop out of school, I'd be like, aren't you learning valuable things here? Like, not to be a mechanic, not to have a vocation, but to develop as a knowledgeable, mature, human being. That's the function of liberal arts education, right? To develop ourselves as human beings. It's not to get you a specific vocational job. You should just go to vocational school if you want a specific vocational job. So that's in general. Now, I would say when this conversation takes place kind of countrywide, I have a dim view of a lot of what is called higher education today. So when I hear people talking about needing higher education, and they mean not what we're doing here, but what a lot of people do out there, I think that's a big waste of time and money, and we are insane as a country for doing what we're doing with it. So if it's that kind of education, no, I don't think women need that, because I don't think men need that either. So. So let me ask maybe one more quick question, or maybe, I don't know, I don't think I need to ask any more. We can let the student questions drive things. If we have student questions.
Yeah.
Or we don't need them yet. All right, let me ask a question while we collect the questions. So there's a few places in the New Testament, maybe this is Noel's question, there are a few places in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul refers back to creation. Notice we both talked about creation quite a bit. Creation and the fall and redemption, that whole process is important in thinking about this. But the Apostle Paul refers back to creation on a number of places. And he says, for example, that Adam was created first and then Eve. That Eve was made for Adam's sake, not Adam for Eve's sake. That's 1 Corinthians 11. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but Eve. Do you think those have any enduring thing to say to us today, or were those particularities of first century Roman Jewish ways of thinking?
So, I don't think that women need to wear head coverings, nor clearly do I think that women can't teach, which is the context in which Paul brings these up. In those two places. So I'm not a biblical scholar, and I have already committed to saying this. If you have further questions about this, you should definitely go talk to Dr. Rabinowitz, because he knows way more about this than I do. But, so Paul is using those interestingly, right? So Adam, in the account of the fall that we have, Eve shows some deliberation over whether or not she's going to eat the apple, and Adam apparently is standing there the whole time and then takes a bite without deliberation. He doesn't even say anything. So, so if we're to take the count literally, that's what happens there. So Paul is, I think, describing a situation and addressing it in a particular way. That's the only way that this really makes sense to me. And there's a lot of different explanations of this. But the one about women teaching is kind of interesting. I've been reading a very little bit about it in between, thesis writing and stuff like that. And one sense of it is that Paul writes to Timothy and says the things that he says in 1 Timothy 2, which I printed out, and he says that that I desire that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise, women should adorn themselves respectably, etc., and they should be quiet. And then he says, I don't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, rather she's to remain quiet. And the sense that some theologians have, or biblical scholars have, is that he's speaking into a particular situation in which there's a context in which there was some rumbling about women actually sort of taking over as the sole authority, because there was various cults that the people were living among and things like that, where women priestesses, that kind of thing, where they kind of ran the show. And he's saying, so I'm going to tell you that men should do this thing and women should do this thing. What I don't mean is that women should take over. What I mean is this other thing. And here's like a reason why, because, Adam was formed first and then Eve, but that's not, he's using it as sort of a principle to speak into that situation. He's not, obviously, right, the animals were formed first. So if we were to take this as merely a principle, we'd have to sort of do it well and wonder what that means. Is there some kind of something that's happening in that story, right? So I know there's differing views on this, and they mainly fall down on whether Paul is giving us a transcendent sort of for all time principle, or whether he's speaking with biblical support into a particular context. And that, I think, makes sense to me. And again, I'm not a biblical scholar, but that seems to read with the rest of the Pauline epistles, which are also into particular church contexts, well. But I can be disagreed with, which I've placed in the passive voice purposely.
I might disagree with you.
That's very poor grammar.
I think we're still collecting, but let me ask a question before we have those questions to take a look at. Mr. Talcott, there seems to be a general versus a particular difference in your emphasis. So you've got 3 overarching responsibilities for men and 3 overarching responsibilities for women. And Professor Wilkinson wants to say, well, that may be true in broad terms, but there's some specific realities of my life and my husband's life that are also worth taking into account. To what degree do you think that there's room for taking those particularities into account? How fixed are those general propositions as we apply them to individual cases? This marriage, that marriage, this life, that life.
Yeah, good. So I don't want to say anything specific about Alyssa's situation. I want to speak more generally. There's freedom within form. Okay, so there is freedom within structure for individual variation, for individual peculiarities, idiosyncrasies. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Right? Each of us is a unique snowflake. And that's the truth. That's the truth, right? I mean, no 2 people are exactly alike, and no 2 men are exactly alike. There's not one among us who is perfect or the model, and we should all be like Matt Parks or any particular person. So it looks very different. There's quite a bit of freedom within form, but there is form, and I do think the form is important, and the form needs to be there. In the realities of this world, there's a lot of things that go wrong and require short-term immediate solutions, and that require us often not to be able to do what's ideal. And so I try to be as generous as I can with that. I think we should be generous with each other with that. But there is, with that form, that is still the form and structure that should be strived for. And I think not striving for that is not only to fail to live up to our callings, but also it will lead to practically, in the practical sphere, will lead to bad effects.
Can I add one tiny thing to that? I think that also there's a big difference between someone exhibiting gifting in an area that might be thought typically male or typically female, and someone abdicating something that is part of their calling. So it would be bad if I were to abdicate the things that I do because of my calling as a female, even though at the same time I can live into other giftings and callings. It would be disastrous if my husband abdicated his responsibility to protect me. That would be bad. And the scripture is very harsh on men who just don't bother to provide for their families. They're worse than infidels or something like that. And that seems to be not just a cultural bound principle, but a timeless one.
Yeah, along those same lines, often the idiosyncrasies, that's the right way to say it, right? Idiosyncrasies? Yeah. Those can enhance your ability to live out your calling. So you can do it in a unique way if you have a unique sub-gifting. But I also am opposed to the kind of tendency to see everything as a matter of individual variation, so that the fact that we're male and female no longer speaks to us in important ways, and it's just whether you're individually gifted in a certain way. I think individual giftings function within the broader sexual context.
Several questions in here, sort of following up on that point, asking about maybe hard cases where you have a choice between what seems to be a bad male leader and a woman much more seemingly capable in that position. How do you negotiate those type of situations where you have suboptimal situations, and at what point do you say, well, you suggested sort of emergency measures, how do we invoke those, and how do we maintain a principle of invoking those perhaps within the boundaries of a broader commitment to well-defined roles for male and female?
With a lot of prudence and care. And I mean, sort of what I'm thinking about here is trying to help us avoid that situation, right? So take as many steps as you can to avoid the situation of having people unprepared for their callings. But there are a lot of, it would vary a lot in the circumstances and the context. In some relations, it's more urgent than others. And yeah, some emergencies are more severe than others. Temporary versus long-term. I mean, there's so many particularities. It's hard to give a general answer to it. There are certain ones where I think you don't ever want to do it, and pastors I think would be one example. I don't think you should have female pastors, even if all the dudes around are really lousy. I don't know. You might be able to force me into a really emergency situation, but in general, I think certain prudence is required. But there's again, with pastors and a few other major functions, I think you don't ever want to do it. And insofar as you can, you want to strive towards the ideal, right? You want to strive so that in 3 years you don't have this situation still, right? I would say this is true in a marriage. This is true in broader society. So.
And there's, I would say, a difference between context too, because in a marriage is different than a professional context. So a woman who is gifted at leading in a professional context, and we can talk about professional context and things, but ought to be empowered to lead in that context because that's what she's good at, that's what she got hired to do. I would be very hard-pressed to agree that a man should ever be promoted over a woman simply because I would never agree that that should happen, ever, in a professional context, not because of my culture, but because it's wrong.
Yeah, the professionalization of society and the technological industrial changes of the last 200 years have radically altered all out, and we need to rethink that in radical ways as Christians. A lot of what we do, a lot of our lives have been industrialized, bureaucratized, and professionalized, so that we now are no longer really interacting as people, we're interacting as cogs in this functional machine. And if you just have a function that needs to be performed, well, you can do that. You know, if you just have a mechanical function to do, you can do that with a man as well as a woman. And most of our jobs are like that. We need a registrar, you just hire whoever's competent to do the registrar thing. But I would say what that does is it depersonalizes. I mean, we have a depersonalized economic structure. And so, you know, as Christians, we have to deal with that. As men and women, we have to deal with that. And senior thesis awaits many of you to try to figure out how to deal with that.
A number of other questions moving in a different direction, following up on some of Mr. Wilkinson's concerns about relationship. And questions like, how do you maintain good boundaries and care within male-female relations outside of marriage? What are some guidelines for that? How do you show that respect and the care for the difference as well as the common dignity?
I have way too many thoughts on this, honestly, and I'm happy to talk to people about it. I don't want to say prudence, but I'm going to. I am a woman who all of my mentors and many of my friends are men. And my husband is a man who has had the opposite be true for him. This is for a variety of reasons stemming from the day I started college at an engineering school and just sort of continuing onwards, right? He and I have carefully settled within our relationship what that means for us in those other relationships. I don't know that it works the same way for every person, and I think different people have different boundaries. But I have lots of thoughts about how it ought to be and how I wish it were that I can't bring up here. I don't think that it's a when Harry met Sally situation in all cases, though. I'll say that. So that's my opinion there.
Be honest with yourself about the situations you get yourself into. We have an incredible capacity to deceive ourselves, run from that. And when you sense yourself honestly in your heart getting into a dangerous situation, get out and be careful. So.
And yet, don't throw up unnecessary barriers. Yeah, don't throw up unnecessary barriers. I don't know how else to say that. It is good to care for people. It's a good thing. It's always a good thing, and that can look like lots of different things.
Yeah, I think we can care for each other as men and women too. I mean, as unmarried men and women too, right? You all can. So one thing I wanted to say kind of along these lines too is, you know, it'd be nice if we had a community, which we kind of do and kind of don't, where the dominant theme, right, is affirmation of the other in who they are, right? So it's easy to complain about Kingsmen this or Kingswomen that, right? Hey, maybe let's like try to affirm each other in being what we are, accentuate the positive, right? I honestly think that would help you have a lot more fun with each other, right? So anyway.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, so I kind of wanted to close along those lines. Are there any other thoughts about our own community? You know, it's nice to sort of have a discussion in the abstract of these things, but it's probably best to sort of try to penetrate our own hearts a little bit here. Where are we failing? Where can we be stronger? How can we express these ideals as maybe not identical, the two models you're setting out here, but how can we express these things more fully as a community?
So I see good things. We both watch you on Facebook, and I see good things. And I'm grateful for the kind of intra and cross-gender friendships that I see around here. I just think that's really positive. I don't know, I feel like you actually sort of said it. Okay, so within marriage, it's a really bad thing when a wife is always denigrating her husband. And I think that's more broadly, whoa, I just almost made up a word like extrapolatable, but that's kind of what I mean, right? You can like, it's not helping anyone, right? It's not healthy. It's an unhealthy community that denigrates half of its community in some way, makes broad, stereotypical, sweeping statements about each other, when really what we should be doing is showing each other respect and showing each other love and modeling for the outside world what healthy relationships could look like within a particular institution. That seems important to me. I mean, the language we use matters. It does.
Yeah, I would also say too, I mean, it's been a hard year because we've had our housing separated from our campus, right? The classroom campus. So we've all been dealing with that in different ways. But, you know, the social intermixing in public settings is a very good thing. Men enjoy the company of women. Women enjoy the company of men. I've noticed this thing, I have deep insight into human nature. And you know, I would encourage the social mixing, right? Let 1,000 flowers bloom. And,
All right, thanks, Brad. Well, we are out of time, so we want to be able to get to new classes. But please join me again in thanking Talcott.